on, everybody? It's Yugioh coming at you with a brand new video, and today I wanted to talk about my board breaker tier list for February 2024 post Phantom Nightmare to follow up on my hand trap tier list that I gave to y'all a few days prior. Speaking of, if you haven't seen my hand trap tier list post Phantom Nightmare, please be sure to check it out, as it's going to go a lot more in depth on the actual format than this video, and it's sort of like a precursor for the board breaker video. As a reminder from the hand trap tier list, I am taking a sample size out of decks that have topped or won regionals in the last couple of weeks now that the new format before Phantom Nightmare has started. I've collected data on over 23 decks and how many of them played different kinds of board breakers in the format, and so I'll be using that as well as data from our speculation coming from Phantom Nightmare in order to make my predictions on this list. The TLDR though is that Phantom Nightmare is going to be bringing a lot of interesting things to the format, most notably of course being the Snake Eyes Fire King deck because of cards like Promethean Princess and Populous. Also due to the introduction of Transaction rollback out of Maze of Millennia, it's going to make Labyrinth a significantly stronger deck and probably significantly more represented than it was before. Because of this, those will essentially be the two main decks we will be kind of building this list around when it comes to facing against them. Though of course there are plenty of other tier 1.5 and below decks such as Unchained Rescue Ace and Mannadium, the latter of which being completely untouched on the Forbidden and Limited list, and the former two still being incredibly solid decks even after their slight hits. With that being said though, let's go ahead and get right into my board breaker tier list for February 2024 post Phantom Nightmare. Starting us off, we have Darkhole, the classic board breaker, and regrettably I have to say that Darkhole is not in a very great spot right now. Darkhole does literally nothing to Labyrinth as a deck 99.9% of the time, especially if they have Lady on board who just can't be destroyed, period, if they have a set card. And then against Snake Eyes, you're kind of just helping them a lot by popping stuff between like the Fire Kings and then the Amblo Whale summoning back their SP and then like the Princess and everything. And there's like a bunch of different things that like Darkhole kind of just triggers that you really don't want to be using it. And the same can be said about Regeki. It's like basically the exact same vein. Not to mention when it comes to SP, it can just banish their good cards anyway, and they can come back during the end phase if you're unable to kill them, which is probably likely. Next up on the list is Dark Ruler, and Dark Ruler, it's in a bit of an awkward spot because it doesn't really do anything to Labyrinth or Snake Eye Fire King stuff at all. I mean, most of the time they're just gonna end like the Amblo Whale and like some back row, and then Lab of course ends on like no monsters, so it really doesn't affect them. But Dark Ruler is pretty solid against a lot of lower tier decks, especially ones that actually end on the SP instead of keeping it in graveyard like in the case of the Snake Eyes Fire King stuff. And it's pretty solid against Unchained overall if they don't also end on Escape on top of their end board, which they will have to make some sacrifices due to Sharvara being at 1, and so they have to play their hand, especially around hand traps, awkwardly. And then against decks like Mannadium, for example, Mannadium isn't always going to have access to their counter traps, so Dark Ruler becomes like a complete blowout, and then like a bunch of other lower tier decks are going to be completely affected by it. But then there's a lot of other lower tier decks that aren't really going to be affected at all by it, such as Bestial Runic. They're just going to use their Runic cards and then their Bestials in hand, all their back row. The one card you have to worry about is like SP specifically and like the Baron. So it's in like a really awkward spot because it's just not super amazing in my opinion compared to other cards that you could play. Because of this, I'm going to put it in the minimal category. It's not that it does like minimal work, period, because if you can hit a really strong end board, then you can hit a really strong end board. But there's too many decks right now that end on either a bunch of back row in the case of Lab, or they end on a really balanced mix of back row, monsters, stuff in hand, stuff in grave, to where it's much more difficult to get the maximum value Dark Ruler could have gotten back in its heyday. So next up on our list is going to be Forbidden Droplet, and compared to Dark Ruler, I think Droplet is going to be significantly better. It already saw a significant increase in play compared to Dark Ruler in terms of the sample size, with Dark Ruler only having 2 and Droplet having 7 out of 23 decks. And I think it's pretty simple to see why. I mean, Droplet is a very reactive card as opposed to Dark Ruler, which is kind of just an immediate use it and then just kind of pray they don't have anything else. But Droplet you can actually use throughout your turn as you're building your resources, with a lot of decks also having graveyard effects right now that you can trigger off of your Forbidden Droplet sending them. It also makes it a lot better to actually use because it can give you that benefit as well, and it's also really good to use it on cards you might have already had on field. A random example being like Fire Formation Tenki, right? Use it to search and then use it as fodder. And then who can forget, of course, activating Runic cards and then chaining Droplet to send said Runic cards. Same with like Infinite Impermanence. Of course, Labyrinth isn't really going to be making use of this. Labyrinth doesn't really use board breakers very often. If they do, it's things like Lava Golem, which we will talk about, of course, in this list. But I think decks like the Snake Eye Fire King stuff can absolutely make use of Droplet, not to mention all of the lower tier decks, especially decks that are playing the Runic package, which is seeing a massive peak in popularity right now, especially because some of the cute interactions you can do. For example, I'm on Live Twin Runic Sprite, and so I can go like normal Leela, effect, chain a Runic card, chain another Runic card, send all three, and then whatever I special off the Leela can then trigger its effect to summon a Leela from deck. It's super powerful. But because of this, I'm going to be putting it in the blowout category, again, because decks like Labyrinth can't really make as good use of it, and because similar to Dark Ruler, there are a lot of threats that are actually like in the graveyard and hand and stuff that you also want to get around. It's not like the most insane card you can play, but a lot of decks can make use out of Droplet. Ever since Arias Heart got banned, we really have been seeing just how powerful Droplet is again. Next up, we have Evenly Matched, and Evenly Matched has actually come to shock me lately. Because when I was looking at my sample size, I noticed that 9 out of the 23 decks have been playing Evenly Matched, and I was very, very confused, because Evenly was a card that had kind of completely phased out of the meta ever since the introduction of SP Little Knight, because SP can of course banish itself and another card on your field to keep it safe from the Evenly, and then you still get to keep a third card off like the Evenly Matched banish, something like a Baron probably, or it may be even like if you already used that Baron to try and negate something before the Evenly, you can banish the Baron to reset it and then keep another really powerful card. And with basically everybody and their grandmother playing SP, I mean, like, why would you put in Evenly? But in that regard, a lot of people keep forgetting about Evenly Matched existing because of this, and so they end up actually not preparing for it very much, not really ending on SP in fear of it in games 2 and 3, and so Evenly can actually come in a lot of handy. A lot of decks can't really end on the SP most of the time. For example, Labyrinth isn't usually going to end on it, they'd rather keep their own pieces, or even go into something like a Muckraker or Chaos Angel, but I think that Evenly will fall off a bit more, because against Labyrinth, while this card is incredibly powerful, especially if they don't go Eradicate or Declare Traps, against Snake Eye Fire King, it's not really amazing. I mean, they're usually just going to keep either one of their like powerful disruptions, like if they make a Baron or something, or more importantly, they'll keep something like the Amblo Whale if they end on it, because then during your main phase 2, they can still use the Princess Engrave, pop 2 cards, and then use the Amblo Whale to summon back their SP or something, and then still get multiple disruptions off of that, and they most likely have a ton of follow-up to kill you on the next turn because you couldn't kill them without your battle phase. I think it's a strong card, especially against Lab. Like I said, Evenly is just absolutely huge against that deck, especially when they're not prepared by going Eradicate or Declare Traps. And so I'm going to put it in the blowout category. I think you can definitely make some use out of it, though you do have to watch out for the Snake Eye Fire King matchup, which is probably going to be the most represented deck. Next up is Duster, and Duster actually had the highest representation of any of these board breakers at 14 out of 23 decks playing it. And I think that one's pretty obvious. I mean, no matter how good Duster actually is in a format, quote unquote, Duster is almost always going to see play regardless, just because of those really sacky back row matchups. Or even like disregarding Labyrinth, there's always random stun decks running around, as we actually saw top a regional very recently. It was a regional, it was like some other really big tournament, and it just randomly topped the regional, and there's always things like, you know, Labyrinth, even certain Trap Tricks builds like ending on extra back row. And so Duster is always basically going to be a side deck staple for most people if they can afford to play it, and I think it's going to be especially good now that Labyrinth is such a powerful deck. Granted, transaction rollback and the graveyard effects of Big Welcome and other things make it a little bit easier for the deck to actually play through it, not to mention they can just use all their furniture pieces, clock, everything, and still hold their own on your turn, especially as long as they can play like a Karma Cannon or something. That card's absolutely insane, but it's definitely going to be very difficult for them, not to mention it's really good against decks like Runic, even if they're keeping all their Runic spells in hand. If you hit the Fountain, I mean, that means they can't use those Runic cards, and then now you're also hitting their Regain, maybe even Branded Beast if they're playing that. So I think Duster is actually going to be very awesome in the next format. I think just about everybody will try to keep at least one in their side, just because of how prominent decks like Lab are probably going to be. Next on the list is Chalice, and Chalice is in a similar boat to how I'm going to talk about Imperm in this video and how I talked about it and similar cards in my hand trap tier list, in that single disruption negations, especially ones that target, aren't really going to be that amazing. It's better than Imperm in my opinion, which, I mean, let's just put Imperm below Chalice here, because Imperm's already going to fall off as a hand trap, right, in general, but now Chalice, at least you can use like during your turn after you start doing things, so if they use something like an SP, you can at least hit that there. but even then, again, it's just a single disruption that you're really doing compared to something like Droplet that's basically very minimal, like, what is it? A very minimal cost or downside compared to like the amount of advantage and value that you get out of it, especially when you set it going first and you just get rid of some of your dead cards that you don't really need anymore to use it. So I think both of these cards are going to be a lot less great than they were now, like at least when it comes to talking about Imperm. Next on the list is Kaijus, and I mean, Kaijus really aren't going to be doing anything too crazy. I mean, they can out towers and stuff, but I mean, purely as a deck has just completely fallen off. And I mean, I guess if you're playing against like that one Raid Raptor player at your locals, this can fuck them up a little bit. But in general, a single Kaiju isn't going to be anything to write home about. It's just not really enough interruption. And the same goes for Kaiju Slumber, which I have omitted from this list, especially because it is so similar to Dark Hole and Regeki that we've already agreed has been pretty low value. Next on our list is Typhon. I love Typhon. I'm so glad everyone else seems to as well, because this card jumped from $12 to $40 in like the blink of an eye. I literally had no idea it happened until one of my mutuals on Twitter started talking about selling theirs. And I think that Typhon moves into a bit of an interesting spot going into the next format. Like when you're going against Snake Eyes decks, like they're really going to end on like the Amblo Whale and like stuff like that, and like things that aren't really going to get maximum value from Typhon going against it. I mean, if they go into like the Baron, they can't use the Baron, but by the time you're committing to a Typhon, it's most likely that you're already going to be doing stuff for the Baron to negate. Not to mention that the moment the Typhon hits the board, if you do that like first thing, they're just gonna use Princess to pop it. However, Lab is going to be making amazing use out of this card because it is a theme that they can make out of their minimal monsters that they have on board. Not to mention that they are just going to be playing 3 anyway due to Extra. And so what you can do is that playing Lab, you can bait out disruptions using all of your like trap cards and your engine pieces, and then even use just a small furniture piece to go into the Typhon, and then out some stuff on the board at least. But compared to other decks, you actually have your back row to back you up on that. I mean, even against Lab, it's not even that horrible because, I mean, they're probably going to be using cards like Karma Cannon to book all your stuff face down anyway, so if you have one monster left that you can spare, going into Typhon means that they at least can't use Lady, if they haven't, of course, used the effect already. So it's not like the worst thing ever, but still, I mean, it's kind of iffy. Going against a lot of lower tier decks like Monadium and stuff, it can put in some decent value, but I don't know. I'm gonna put it in Blowout just because it is such a powerful card that you can make at least after you play through your opponent's stuff. Less so for the Floodgate, more so for the bounce as well as the battle, because it's just turning any monster into 2900 beater that also has a non-targeting return from field to hand effect. So even in situations where you're not getting maximum value out of the Floodgate, you can at least use it as a powerful big body to maybe at least stall and prevent yourself from dying next turn. So next up on our list is Fenrir, and Fenrir, you'll notice, probably if you've seen my older tier list at least, is actually a brand new contender on the Board Breaker tier list, probably because it took up 11 decks out of my 23 deck sample size. And this card is just everywhere, even outside of like the 2 pure cash decks. Maybe it was like 1 or 2 pure cash decks that I looked at. Yeah, just one of them. There was still Sony decks just playing Fenrir at 2 or 3 copies as an engine because it's just such a strong card. I mean, you're getting a big 2400 body, something that can banish a face-up card face down, making it almost impossible to get back, and can search another copy of itself, either as a follow-up card in case your board is broken, in case the Fenrir itself is outed at least, or even if you're just getting discard fodder with it. It's just like what I was saying with Droplet. I mean, you can literally go like activate Fenrir to search, and then they like maybe chain in a negate or something just so you don't get something or whatever, and then you can like chain Droplet, sending your Fenrir just so you can special another one. It's especially good against cards like SP because, I mean, if you special the Fenrir and then use the search, they're gonna have to use another card to actually get rid of it or like negate it or something, because if you chain SP, they're just gonna special the Fenrir that they search. It's almost like a jack of all trades, the only downside being that it can't really hit face down cards, so that makes certain aspects of the Lab matchup a bit worse, but I mean, it's still pretty decent in the Lab matchup because if they use any out that isn't like Karma Cannon and they do it too early, you can just special the other Fenrir. So because of the sheer representation of the card and just how powerful it can end up being, I'm gonna put it in the busted category at the top. I think this card is very powerful, and so long as it stays at 3, is probably going to see play until it gets hit in some way, shape, or form. In a similar vein, on the last Forbidden and Limited list, we finally got Dino Wrestler Pankratops to 2 copies after God, how many years has this card been limited? Like 4 now? Maybe 5? This card used to be like the most mandatory side deck 3 of staple in just about every single side deck. And even some decks were maining it, and if you were playing a blind second deck, you were absolutely maining it, because this card has so much value. And it's interesting when we talk about Pankratops now, because let's assume it was at 3 copies, right? A lot of people argue that Fenrir has just power crept and replaced Pankratops as a card, but I really wouldn't argue that to be the case, because, I mean, hell, we've even seen people start to play Pankratops again after a while now that it's back at 2, but Pankratops actually has its own uses that makes it better than Fenrir in certain situations. So while Fenrir does get the extra copy of itself for the follow-up, as well as banishes a card, Pankratops has the advantage of being a quick effect whenever it wants, as opposed to being reactionary in a new chain, so you can do it like immediately in response to something. You can also specially, even if you already have another monster on board, which is pretty damn cool. It's actually 2600 attack as opposed to 2400 attack, which doesn't seem like a big difference, but there's a lot of cards with 2500 attack, like more than you'd think, that makes Pankratops a lot easier to beat over them with. And Pankratops can also hit face down cards, meaning that it's better going into back row matchups. This means that Fenrir is basically just better in decks that can actually make use out of the discard that it provides, or if they just really want to use it as a link material after making use of the effect, especially in like the battle phase or when breaking a board. But Pankratops is also a very solid card, and I think at 3 it'll definitely see a shit ton of play again like it used to. For now though, because it's at 2 and we're probably gonna see like a lot more tinkering with it than anything, I'm gonna put it in the blowout category. I think it is a very strong card, again being able to be a massive body that can chain itself to remove itself in case your opponent tries to out it compared to Fenrir, in which case you'd have to go like main phase 2, especially the other Fenrir, to get value out of that, quote unquote. I think that Pankratops can do a lot more than people give it credit for such an old card. Next on our list is Kurikara, and Kurikara is... it's a bit weird to talk about because Kurikara, I think as a card, isn't really going to be that amazing. I mean, let's see. SP outs itself. None of the lab cards really care about getting Kurikara. The Amblo Whale isn't going to do anything on field, and like the Princess is just making use out of it. And there's just so many other cards that really don't care about Kurikara's existence. But because it is searchable in the Snake Eyes variants, because of the original Simple Spoils Snake Eye and such, it's really seeing a lot of play just due to that. So I think it's weird because I don't want to put it in blowout just because of the representation. I want to put it at the top of minimal because, again, Kurikara doesn't really hit that many decks because there's so many cards that are either already going to get enough value by just like doing their negate or whatever other effect before you Kurikara them, and also just so many cards that out themselves when they already do their effect, that Kurikara isn't going to get the maximum value that it could back in like Kashtira format, for example. But it's a searchable board breaker that you can play as a one-of for niche situations in the Snake Eyes variants, which again are going to probably be, and actually most definitely be, the most represented deck in my opinion, and to the opinion of the Yu-Gi-Oh masses right now. So I'm gonna put it at the very top of the minimal category. Next on our list is the Book of Moon cards, being Book of Moon, Book of Eclipse, Book of Lunar Eclipse and stuff. But we're mainly going to be talking about Book of Moon. So when it comes to Book of Moon, I mean, I'm gonna put it at the just above Dark Ruler in minimal. I'm putting it below Imperm and Chalice because the Imperm can still be used as a hand trap even though the representation is going to drop a little bit, and it's probably going to be main decked if it is used as a hand trap. And then Chalice can be used pretty reactionary compared to Book of Moon, whereas Chalice can be used in response to a negate. Book of Moon isn't going to really out many things that are already negating. When we talk about Book of Moon or even Book of Eclipse, the thing is a lot of decks right now, or at least the top 2 decks, aren't really going to be caring about the book cards at all because they're going to be either ending on cards they don't really care if they're flipped face down, or they're going to be ending on link monsters, meaning that it's not going to really do anything unless you set it going first as another card, or if you just use it as a 1-for-1 trade against, like, I don't know, a Baron at least, you can get rid of an Omni. But at that rate, you could just use so many other cards, for example, Imperm. It can be pretty useful in the other matchups, such as Unchained. You can book the King Caesar and stuff. But other than that, it really doesn't get as much value as it could in prior formats, especially now that Imperm isn't going to be as prominent, meaning you don't have to rely on using it to dodge Imperm on your own cards. Next up, we have Lava Golem, and Lava Golem's in an interesting spot. Against all of like the 1.5 and lower decks that I mentioned, things like Rescue Ace, Unchained, Monadium, stuff like that, Lava Golem is massive. I mean, you're basically outing the entire board in the case of, like, Rescue Ace and Unchained. And against Monadium, that's 2 negates out of the way, potentially even more if you hit something like an Appaloosa. But Labyrinth, which is probably going to be one of the decks that would actually play it because they've played it in the past, they don't really care too much because they're just going to be using back row. And against Fire King, Snake Eyes stuff, there's a bit of a problem. So yeah, you're outing, like, the Ambler Whale and, like, another card on their board and stuff. But, it's a fire. And Princess doesn't have to target like a Link monster or anything, it just targets a fire you control. So they're still getting the Princess effect in other cards that are going to trigger, and they still have all that follow-up, and you just lost your normal summon. Despite this though, because of how powerful it is against the decks that I mentioned other than that, I'm going to put it at the lower end of Blowout. If your deck can play it, and you know you can at least get rid of the Lava Golem before they can make use of like any sort of Fire King engine or anything like that, or using it as a link material or a big body, I think that Lava Golem can be absolutely insane because you're outing 2. But against the top 2 decks of the format, I don't really think it's going to be one of the better cards you could use, at least in comparison to some other things on this list, such as Droplet. Next up, we have Lightning Storm, and Lightning Storm actually had one of the highest success rates at these regionals, with 10 out of the 23 decks actually using it in the main or side. And again, similar to Duster, Lightning Storm is just there as a very powerful card, because not only is it possible to use it in the exact same vein as Duster, which is already going to be outing a bunch of back row, but you could also alternate in case maybe they didn't end on as much back row, they went for a bit more of a monster approach. You can just hit the monsters instead. And again, while Regeki and Dark Hole have shown that it's not really like the best thing to do that, sometimes if you do need to flex into it, at least you have the option, while also instead potentially having a powerful Duster effect. And so I'm going to be putting Lightning Storm at the top of the categories in the busted tier, because I think it is going to be very strong. And like I said, it's usually just like the 2 Storm plus the Duster to be as the second and third copies of Duster, but it also has that little bit of extra flexibility, despite being a hard once per turn, which isn't really a big problem. Next up, we have Super Poly, and I mean, it's weird, because I think Super Poly can definitely have its moment. So when I think about Super Poly against like the best decks right now, I'm thinking of using it against like the Fire King Snake Eye stuff to make Mudragon or Garura, and then making Garura against Lab. Or potentially even if Mudragon there as well if they make like a Chaos Angel or something, because Chaos Angel can't be unaffected by spell effects. So in theory, you can get some insane value out of this card. If the Snake Eye variant is playing the field spell and they use it to summon a fire from their spell and trap zone to their field to make Princess live again, it can definitely make it a bit more interesting. But if you make Mudragon specifically, it can actually throw a wrench in their gears, because then they can't use targeting or anything if you use the Mudragon effect to change it to whatever attribute you're using. So I think Super Poly has some potential. I think I want to put it... I think I'll actually put it above Typhon here, because I was gonna put it in like the minimal category because I was thinking about it, but now that I really think about it, this card can probably go nuts if you can afford the extra deck space to play it. I know for a fact that if I were playing Lab right now with Transaction Rollback, which I was going to, I actually had planned on playing Super Poly just because of how versatile it can be, and because cards like Mudragon giving you that targeting protection is a lot more important than a lot of people actually give it credit for. Like using that and like declaring Dark, and now all your stuff can't be impermed, veilered, or anything like that, or targeted with effects like the Book of Moon, or with Fenrir, or just anything really. Plus getting that extra body and level 4 potentially if you want to use a rank 4 piece, it can do a lot of stuff there. And even just having Garura to link off into an SP to get the banish and the draw 1 sounds just super cracked. And all for the cost of a discard, especially if it's something that you can use in the graveyard. Maybe you drew an extra copy of Wanted if you're playing a Snake Eye variant or a Diabellstar variant, then that can be just insane. So I think I want to put it in the blowout category. We'll probably have to see like the representation for it to go any higher than this, but I think that it has potential. Next on our list is going to be Talents, and Talents is going to be insane. So basically using Talents either going first or second in this format is going to be massive, because against Lab, they have all of these cards that they want to use to play on your turn 0 between Arius, Kook Clock, Stovey, Chandraglier, all of these things, Lovely, or Lady Labyrinth, I keep mixing them up in my head, Lady Labyrinth as well. there's a lot of different things that they can use that can get you value out of Triple T, be it to rip a card from their hand, draw 2, or even steal in the case of Lady Labyrinth. And going second, it's really good against the Snake Eye Fire King deck, because of course they're going to be utilizing cards such as their Princess and everything, and then things on summon like Snake Eye Ash if they summon it off of their field spell, and then like, you know, Fire King Kieran if they're playing the Fire King variant. Like, there's just so much. But one of the biggest things is definitely Ash being such a powerful hand trap next format. We talked about this more in the hand trap tier list about how Ash is probably going to be the best hand trap, which is probably going to make cards like Thrust and Talents absolutely shine. It's such a versatile card, and it's going to have so much value, especially because of how the format is going to shape up. And finally on our list, we have Zeus, my beloved. I love Zeus to death, and I think in the right situation, especially in a simplified game state, a well-timed Zeus can be massive. But when it comes to actually trying to use it as a board breaker, it's not really all that great. So when you think about Zeus as a board breaker as opposed to like a game state enabler in a simplified game state, you usually have to open it alongside cards like Dark Ruler. Well, the thing is that Dark Ruler kind of sucks right now, and then when you're using cards like Lightning Storm or Duster instead, there's less of a point to make Zeus other than like a follow-up preventer, because the board is, already broken. And so it doesn't really get as much value as it could, not to mention if Evenly sees more plays, Zeus will probably not be as popular, and I don't think either of the top 2 decks are going to be making this card 24/7 when they could just make other things, especially with Labyrinth having access to Karma Cannon, which is basically a Zeus against Link decks. Well, everybody, that is going to do it for my board breaker tier list for the February 2024 format post Phantom Nightmare. This one was actually really fun to make because there was a lot more to talk about than I actually thought about these cards. Because I was like, it's kind of like annoying because hand traps are probably going to be better than board breakers overall. But there's a lot of value you can get out of certain cards, especially cards like Talents and Fenrir. And like I said, I can easily see Super Poly creeping up to be a very powerful card next format. I'm also really happy to see cards like Pankratops coming back now that it's at 2 copies, and I really hope it comes to 3 next list because Pankratops was one of my favorite cards back in 2018-2019 Toss/Eternal format. It was so much fun to use. This tier list is probably very prone to changing though, depending on what the pro scene actually looks like post Phantom Nightmare, again because I think hand traps are more the big focus right now, but I don't know, that's just my opinion. Let me know yours down in the comments below because that's going to do it for the video. If you liked it, please sure to leave a like, assholes. Put this video and the channel into recommended, and if you think this content and you like it, like the rest of my tier list, then perhaps consider subscribing because we're going to 10,000 subscribers by the end of 2024, not to mention it supports the channel or anything else, and it's absolutely free. Also be sure to hit that notification bell if you want to see more awesome Yu-Gi-Oh content. Also, want to support me directly while getting some awesome TCG merchandise in the process, check out tapiocards.com and a link down below. Use code Aurora5 for 5% off your purchase at checkout and to support me financially. But once again, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. This is Aurora, signing off.